On the 6th of August this year, something extraordinary happened on the border between Russia and Ukraine.
These are the images Ukraine wants the world to see, that it's finally got the upper hand over Russia.
For the first time in history, a nuclear-armed country was invaded by a foreign military force.
Its troops crossed into Russian territory, catching Russia's military by surprise.
Ukrainian forces burst across the border and claimed 1,000 square kilometres of Russian territory in an area called Kursk Oblast.
Russia has been trying to show the world it has everything under control in its southwest.
A breach like this is meant to be impossible. The entire point of having nuclear weapons is it's meant to make you invulnerable to foreign invasion, and yet Ukraine did it.
Russia has really struggled to respond.
Right from the start, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, President Vladimir Putin has been threatening to use his country's enormous nuclear arsenal to defend itself in certain situations. He drew red lines that couldn't be crossed without triggering nuclear war.
We do not threaten anything, but everyone should know that we have nuclear weapons and that we will use them if necessary to protect our sovereignty.
Protect our sovereignty. Fear of nuclear war is what's stopping some of Ukraine's allies from giving them certain types of weapons, stuff that can blow things up deep inside Russia.
That's called World War III.
They're worried Ukraine will use them to challenge Russian sovereignty. Yet, Ukraine just invaded Russian sovereign territory and no nukes. Ukraine appears to be calling Vladimir Putin's bluff. They're saying that the emperor has no clothes. It seems that the red lines he'd drawn, which would provoke nuclear retaliation, were done in red pencil, not red pen. So, how does this reshape the war? And what does it mean for the apparently naked emperor? I'm Matt Bevan, and this is If You're Listening. In 1987, Moscow was the centre of the Soviet Empire. A secretive, paranoid authoritarian state that sprawled across a sixth of the world's landmass. And an aspiring pilot named Matthias Rust was about to turn 19 years old. He was from West Germany and had recently begun learning how to fly planes. On the 28th of May, he took off from Helsinki airport in a rented 4-seat Cessna plane, telling air traffic control that he was headed for Sweden, but over the Baltic Sea, he turned off his radio and instead turned east towards Russia. Now, this was an exceptionally crazy thing to do.
This is the Iron Curtain, a wall of concrete, iron and steel that separates the free world from the Kremlin's slave empire.
The Kremlin was extremely paranoid about who came in and out of the Soviet Union, and had a history of blowing unidentified aircraft out of the sky if they entered their territory. And yet...
Rust, a Hamburg computer operator, flew his Cessna 750 kilometres across Soviet territory.
They detected his little plane at various points, but didn't shoot it down.
Soviet planes apparently flew around his small Cessna, but were unsure how to respond.
They lost track of him, and for some reason didn't try very hard to find him again. Then he reappeared over Moscow. Matthias Rust had never been there before, so it took him about half an hour to find his target, Red Square, the heart of the Soviet Empire. After spotting the onion domes of St. Basil's Cathedral, he set his plane down in the square, parked it in a car park, and jumped out. A baffled crowd gathered, all trying to figure out who he was and why he was there.
The 19-year-old West German pilot is reported to have told Soviet police he just wanted to make friends. He apparently handed out peace leaflets to Red Square passers-by and signed autographs for 2 hours before being hustled away by Soviet authorities.
Several officials, right up to the defence minister, got the sack. But this epic joyride, it highlighted an issue that Russia has always faced and still faces today. It is so massive that its borders are impossible to guard. A kid in a rented Cessna literally flew all the way to Red Square without anyone stopping him. So rather than tackle the impossibility of guarding its borders, it keeps invaders away with a promise. If you attack Russia, our enormous nuclear arsenal will make you regret it.
Peace is maintained by the balance of terror. There's no defence, just plenty of mutual assured destruction. That in itself is the defence.
For 7 decades, this promise has stopped anyone except Matthias Rust invading Russia. In fact, apart from a few small border skirmishes between India, Pakistan and China, no nuclear-armed nation has ever been invaded by a foreign power. Ever. But very recently, that changed. Okay, let's jump forward 36 years after Matthias Rust's flight to Red Square in May 2023. Russia's invasion of Ukraine had been going on for more than a year. It had totally transformed life for most Ukrainians all over the country. But in Russia, everything was still pretty normal. People living in major cities weren't on alert for attacks. But then, one night in May...
The night sky over the Kremlin lit up as an apparent drone is shot down in a fiery explosion.
2 drones blew up over the Kremlin on the same night. Nobody was hurt, and there was little to no damage to the buildings. But the following day, the Russian government totally flipped out.
The deputy chair of Russia's Security Council says the attackers left Moscow with little choice but to eliminate Volodymyr Zelenskyy.
At first, it was quite confusing. Nobody really knew what was going on. Ukraine and the US both denied that the drone had come from Ukraine.
We don't attack Putin or Moscow. We fight on our territory.
I would take anything coming out of the Kremlin with a very large shaker of salt.
The US and its allies hadn't given Ukraine access to long-range drones that could fly all the way to Moscow, and for exactly this reason. Ukraine might fly them to Red Square and make Putin really angry and escalate the war. And yet the drones kept coming.
What, Roma?
In the weeks that followed, Moscow's air defence systems were firing at all times of the day and night, shooting more and more drones down.
The drone attacks on Moscow are embarrassing for President Putin. Even though the drones were downed, he's vowed to step up Moscow's air defences.
To protect Moscow and boost air defences there, he had to withdraw equipment from the front line of the war. Eventually, it became clear where these drones were coming from. These weren't drones from America. They were drones that had been made in Ukraine using money raised by social media influencers. Igor Lechenkov was one of them, a 23-year-old Ukrainian with more than 1 million followers across Instagram and Twitter. He'd set up crowdfunding pages for long-range drones that he called Angry Birds. The drones are plane-shaped. They look like an Olympic bobsled with wings. They can carry a 3-kilogram explosive up to 1,000 kilometres and detonate on command.
The explosion on impact, shaking Moscow's business districts.
When Putin didn't react, Ukraine started sending small planes that they had converted into explosive kamikaze drones. And yet Putin still didn't react. Why? Well, we don't know for sure, obviously, but there is a theory, one which I think makes a lot of sense. It could have something to do with this.
And of course, all eyes were on Moscow.
In March 2023, Putin hosted the Chinese President Xi Jinping at the Kremlin. This was a couple of months before the first drone attacks on Moscow. He welcomed his friend with a particularly opulent ceremony.
Russian diplomacy is known for its pomp and pageantry. But few visitors to the Grand Kremlin Palace receive a welcome like this.
Xi and Putin have been close for years and used to have a tradition of meeting up on each other's birthdays.
Xi Jinping and Putin have met more than 40 times.
But the COVID pandemic and the beginning of the war in Ukraine meant that they missed their birthday brunch for 3 years in a row. Who among us hasn't let a friendship fade after accidentally letting a highly contagious virus get out of control or botching an invasion of a neighbouring country? Rekindling the bromance was incredibly important for Vladimir Putin in particular.
And Russia is cut off from international financial arrangement or system. And then Western countries are boycotting purchasing of Russian oil.
While Ukraine has allies in the US, Europe, Australia, Russia only really has China. President Xi had helped Putin out by increasing the amount of trade between China and Russia, but hadn't provided any military help with the invasion of Ukraine.
And China has not declared support for either side during the war.
And that didn't change. In fact, the meeting was not at all what Putin hoped it would be. The Financial Times reports that Xi had come not with an offer, but with a warning. If you want any support from us at all, you can't use any nuclear weapons. Not even little tactical ones designed just for use on the battlefield. None. This wasn't stated publicly, but immediately after the meeting, Chinese officials told anyone who would listen.
Xi Jinping and China wanted to project to the world that China's a responsible great power.
The European Union apparently got the message. Officials there said the risk of nuclear escalation had dropped dramatically after the meeting. Putin, though, denied it. He wouldn't want anyone to think that his red lines could now be crossed. He started moving nukes closer to the front line.
Russia's president confirming that he's moved short-range tactical nuclear weapons closer to Kyiv.
And he made sure to remind everyone that he had his finger hovering over a red button at all times.
It is an element of deterrence, so that all those who are thinking about inflicting a strategic defeat on us are not oblivious to this circumstance.
This meeting, though, remember, it happened before those drone attacks on Moscow. These attacks within Russia weren't enough to make Putin push the button. That might be because of the meeting. We don't know how he would have reacted without this pressure from Xi. But, Ukraine's not playing chicken here. They're not just trying things out until they get nuked, looking for a red line. So why push any further? Well, they have to do something. The war is not going well for Ukraine.
For 3 days now, Russian troops have been bombarding towns and villages as they try to make ground towards the country's second largest city of Kharkiv.
Russian forces have gradually been gaining territory along the southeastern battlefront.
It represents Moscow's growing confidence.
The flow of weapons into Ukraine has been stopping and starting thanks to domestic political infighting in the US and its Western allies.
Ukrainian forces are just hoping more American firepower arrives soon.
And then the US election is looming.
The whole world is looking to autumn, looking to November. And truly speaking, Putin awaits November 2.
And if Donald Trump wins in November, Ukraine's position could change rapidly.
Before I even arrive at the Oval Office, I will have the disastrous war between Russia and Ukraine settled. And it will take me no longer than 1 day.
So while they're not looking to get nuked, Ukraine did push further and did something unprecedented. Away from the battlefield in the south, there's no real physical border between Russia and Ukraine. There's no river or wall or mountain range. It's basically this farm's in Ukraine, that farm's in Russia. There are small border posts on the roads where you cross between the two countries. Before the war, officials were stationed there to do passport and customs checks. But when Russia invaded, these crossings were blocked with landmines. On the Russian side, they were guarded by conscripted troops, while the proper soldiers fought the real war to the south. But then this year, in late July, the towns on the Ukrainian side started filling up with troops. The official story was that they were there for training, or maybe to pick up new equipment, like tanks. It was better that nobody talked about it too much.
In order to surprise the Russian forces, Ukraine did not inform any of its allies, including the United States.
On August 6th, the Ukrainians turned those tanks towards the Russian border posts. There is a video of what the Ukrainians did to the border post near the Russian town of Shudza. And I've got to say, they really pulverised it. I mean, this place doesn't look like it was invaded. It looks like it was hit by a bushfire and a tornado at the same time. From inside the rubble, you can see a few Russian soldiers waving white flags. They are taken captive. But clearly, a lot more died in the attack. Just after the border checkpoint fell, a Ukrainian soldier, Colonel Roman Kostenko, recorded a video to send to the Speaker of the Parliament. Colonel Kostenko also happens to be an MP. He wouldn't be coming to work that day.
A Ukrainian MP apologises to the Speaker. He's not in Parliament because he's going into Russia instead.
But Ukrainian forces didn't stop at the border post.
A convoy of burnt-out Russian army vehicles 50 kilometres from the border.
By the time Russia could respond,
Russia scrambled tanks and planes to its southwest.
Ukraine had claimed an area of Russian territory half the size of Luxembourg. So a foreign country invaded Russian sovereign territory, killing Russian soldiers, taking Russians captive, claiming Russian towns. That's got to be red button territory, right, Putin?
The Kremlin declaring an anti-terrorist operation in 3 border regions.
Yeah, but it's not terrorism, is it? It's an actual invasion of Russia. If that's not the red line, what is? In a speech 2 weeks after the invasion, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said, the whole naive, illusory concept of so-called red lines regarding Russia, which dominated the assessment of the war by some partners, has crumbled somewhere near Shuja. Ukraine has called Putin's bluff. Now that they've done that, what is stopping the West from giving them whatever weapons and support they ask for? Until this invasion, Russia appeared to be winning the war. But this changes everything. Both sides and their allies know it.
Yeah.